Epilogue. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki horrified Leo Szilard. He felt a full measure of guilt for the development of such terrible weapons of war, the shape of things to come that he had first glimpsed as he crossed Southampton Row in Bloomsbury in 1933, had found ominous residence in the world partly at his invitation. In the petition to the President that he had circulated among the atomic scientists in July 1945, the petition Edward Teller, in consultation with Robert Oppenheimer, had decided not to sign, writing Szilard he felt that I should do the wrong thing if I tried to say how to tie the little toe of the ghost to the bottle from which we just helped it to escape. Szilard had argued that large moral responsibilities devolved upon the United States in consequence of its possession of the bomb. The development of atomic power will provide the nations with new means of destruction. The atomic bombs at our disposal represent only the first step in this direction, and there is almost no limit to the destructive power which will become available in the course of their future development. Thus, a nation which sets the precedent of using these newly liberated forces of nature for purposes of destruction may have to bear the responsibility of opening the door to an era of devastation on an unimaginable scale. The United States set that precedent in Japan. Szilard wrote Gertrude Weiss his despairing August 6th letter, saying it was difficult to see what wise course of action was possible after that. But within days he was moving to protest and debate. Upon hearing of the Nagasaki bombing, he immediately asked the chaplain of the University of Chicago to include a special prayer for the dead and a collection for the survivors of the two Japanese cities in any service commemorating the end of the war. He drafted a second petition to the President calling the atomic bombings a flagrant violation of our own moral standards and asking that they be stopped. The Japanese surrender mooted the issue and the petition was never sent. Besides White House and War Department press releases, the United States government immediately published a detailed report on the scientific aspects of atomic bomb development in preparation during the preceding year by Princeton physicist Henry DeWolf Smith. Atomic energy for military purposes was another faded echo of Niels Bohr's appeal for openness. It appalled the British, enlightened the Soviets on which approaches to isotope separation not to pursue, and Groves's intention in releasing it defined what might be public and what secret about the atomic bomb program, thereby forestalling information leaks. With the atomic secret, such as it was, made public, Szilard went to see the Chicago Chancellor, Robert Maynard Hutchins, and told him that something needed to be done to get thoughtful and influential people to think about what the bomb might mean to the world and how the world and America could adjust to its existence. I proposed that the University of Chicago call a 3-day meeting and assemble about 25 of the best men to discuss the subject. Hutchins liked the idea and began contacting twice that many participants, including Henry Wallace, Tennessee Valley Authority Chairman David E. Lilienthal, the ubiquitous Charles Lindbergh, and a number of academics and scientists. The meeting took shape for late September. The day after the Nagasaki bombing, Ernest Lawrence had flown to New Mexico, partly to escape newspaper reporters clamoring for interviews, partly to work with Oppenheimer on a report on post-war planning that the interim committee had solicited from its scientific panel. The inventor of the cyclotron, who approved of the use of the bombs to avoid invasion and force a Japanese surrender, found his Los Alamos colleague weary, guilty, and depressed. Oppenheimer wondered if the dead at Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not luckier than the survivors, whose exposure to the bombs would have lifetime effects. His mood that weekend found expression during the next weeks in letters. "You will believe that this undertaking has not been without its misgivings," he wrote his former ethical culture school teacher, Herbert Smith, the confessor of his youth. "They are heavy on us today, when the future, which has so many elements of high promise, is yet only a stone's throw from despair." To Haakon Chevalier, his friend at Berkeley in Depression days, Oppenheimer repeated that the circumstances are heavy with misgiving and far, far more difficult than they should be, had we power to remake the world to be as we think it. Lawrence could muster only limited patience for Oppenheimer's remorse. He thought the atomic bomb a terrible swift sword that would end the war and might succeed in ending all wars. He also seems to have claimed it as his own. In one newspaper interview out of many published the day after Hiroshima, notes Stanislav Ulam mischievously, E.O. Lawrence modestly admitted, according to the interviewer, that he more than anyone else was responsible for the atomic bomb. From secret participants in a top-secret project, the two men and their colleagues had emerged as public heroes, the artificers of a military revolution. With the discovery of fission, C.P. Snow comments, physicists became almost overnight the most important military resource a nation-state could call upon. The letter on post-war planning that the Berkeley and Los Alamos directors polished that last weekend of the war tried out their new authority. In it, the members of the Interim Committee Scientific Panel, Lawrence, Oppenheimer, Compton, Fermi, set aside merely technical advice to propose a radical rethinking of national policy. In doing so, they began to outline the nuclear dilemma as they understood it. They were convinced, they wrote, that weapons quantitatively and qualitatively far more effective than now available will result from further work on these problems. Among such weapons, they thought the technical prospects of the realization of the superbomb to be quite favorable. They could not, however, devise or propose effective military countermeasures for atomic weapons, and it was their firm opinion that no military countermeasures will be found. They were not only unable to outline a program that would assure this nation for the next decade's hegemony in the field of atomic weapons, but were equally unable to ensure that such hegemony, if achieved, could protect us from the most terrible destruction. What followed, they thought, was the necessity of political change. The development in the years to come of more effective atomic weapons would appear to be a most natural element in any national policy of maintaining our military forces at great strength. Nevertheless, we have grave doubts that this further development can contribute essentially or permanently to the prevention of war. We believe that the safety of this nation, as opposed to its ability to inflict damage on an enemy power, cannot lie wholly or even primarily in its scientific or technical prowess. It can be based only on making future wars impossible. It is our unanimous and urgent recommendation to you that despite the present incomplete exploitation of technical possibilities in this field, all steps be taken, all necessary international arrangements be made to this one end. Oppenheimer had discovered such convictions in his discussions with Bohr, but Lawrence had advised the Interim Committee only 2 months earlier to build up stockpiles. For a time, at the end of the war, the reality of the bomb seems to have moved the Berkeley laureate to at least limited internationalism. There is no doubt in my mind, he wrote during this period, that the best channel of information about what is going on in Russia would be developed by encouraging free interchange of science and scientists. In fact, it is the only avenue I can think of that has a reasonable chance of working. Oppenheimer carried the scientific panel's letter to Washington a few days after the surrender and found Henry Stimson out of town. He talked instead to Stimson's aide George L. Harrison and to Vannevar Bush. I emphasized, of course, that all of us would earnestly do whatever was really in the national interest, no matter how desperate and disagreeable, he wrote Lawrence after he returned to New Mexico, but that we felt reluctant to promise that much real good could come of continuing the atomic bomb work, just like poison gases after the last war. But no more than Leo Szilard before him was Oppenheimer successful at influencing policy from outside the political process, whatever his newfound authority as a consultant. I had the fairly clear impression from the talks with Harrison and Bush that things had gone badly at Potsdam, and that little or no progress had been made in interesting the Russians in collaboration or control. I don't know how seriously an effort was made. Apparently neither Churchill nor Attlee nor Stalin was any help at all, but this is only my conjecture. While I was in Washington, 2 things happened, both rather gloomy. The President issued an absolute ukase forbidding any disclosures on the atomic bomb, and the terms were broad, without his personal approval. The other was that Harrison took our letter to Jimmy Burns, who sent back word just as I was leaving that, in the present critical international situation, there was no alternative to pushing the Manhattan Project program full steam ahead. I do not come away from, i.e., I still feel, a profound grief and a profound perplexity about the course we should be following. The Conference on Atomic Energy Control at the University of Chicago convened on a Thursday and Friday in late September. David Lilienthal kept shorthand notes. Their highlights reveal remarkable prescience among the participants, as does Szilard's memory of the event. Jacob Viner, an influential University of Chicago economist, told the conference that the atomic bomb was the cheapest way yet devised of killing human beings. With two giants, he argued, the Soviet Union and the United States, world government would be impossible. Degree of peace we have had in the past 2 or 3 centuries, Lilienthal noted of Viner's comments, has been due to uncertainty as to who was your natural enemy. Now, no ambiguity as to target, where there are only 2 giants, already having psychological effects in this country. Viner thought atomic bomb warfare more largely a war of nerves. Psychological warfare begins when 2 countries have atomic bombs. Believes atomic bomb will be peacemaking in effect, deterrent effect, the cost when it is used against you. Only 5 weeks after the first use of nuclear weapons in war, Viner had ferreted out the essential principle of deterrence, of the balance of terror in a nuclear-armed world. Szilard presented his ideas to the group on Friday. He emphasized that the bombs would get bigger, bypassing secrecy by quoting a public statement of Mark Oliphant's to the effect that weapons corresponding to 1 million and to 10 million tons of TNT are entirely possible. Of Szilard's talk, Lilienthal noted, "We are in an armament race. If Russia starts making atomic bombs in 2 or 3 years, perhaps 5 or 6 years, then we have an armed peace, and it will be a durable peace. But we will not have permanent peace at lesser cost than world government. But this cannot come without changed loyalty of people. If we can't have that, all we can have is a durable peace, i.e. deterrence. Only purpose of a durable peace would be to create conditions 20 to 30 years from now that can bring about world peace. That requires shift of loyalties. If we are sure to get a third world war, the later it comes, the worse for us. Victor of next war will make a world government, even if that victor should be the United States, having lost 25 million people dead." Szilard himself came to believe his predictions unimpressive. He thought Viner did better. The wisest remarks that were made at this meeting were made by Jake Viner, and what he said was this: "None of these things will happen. There will be no preventive war, and there will be no international agreement involving inspection. America will be in sole possession for a number of years, and the bomb will exert a certain subtle influence. It will be present at every diplomatic conference in the consciousness of the participants, and will exert its effect. Then, sooner or later, Russia will also have the bomb, and then a new equilibrium will establish itself." No longer shackled to army secrecy, Leo Szilard would continue and increase his participation in the political life of his adopted country. But whether from guilt, or because nuclear physics no longer seemed to him a frontier, or because he had come to understand that the liberation of atomic energy was far more likely to enable man to destroy the Earth than to leave it behind for the stars, the cause for which he had taken up studying the nucleus in the first place, he closed the loop he opened in 1932, went off in 1947 to Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory on Long Island to audit the phage course offered there, and turned away from physics to biology. H.G. Wells lived to know of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Deeply pessimistic in his final years, he died at 80 on August 13, 1946. Immediately after Trinity, Edward Teller and Enrico Fermi had renewed theoretical work on the problem of thermonuclear ignition. The end sought, explains the Los Alamos Technical History, was a bomb burning about a cubic meter of liquid deuterium. For such a bomb, the energy release will be about 10 million tons of TNT. But with the Japanese surrender, hydrogen bomb studies at Los Alamos temporarily slowed and stopped. General Groves, Oppenheimer would later testify, was unclear whether his mandate, and therefore mine, extended to fiddling with this next project. I so reported to the people in the laboratory who were thinking about it. Teller, frustrated, suspected his colleagues had lost their appetites for weapons work. Some had. Most simply wanted to go home. We all felt, Hanspeter remembers, that like the soldiers we had done our duty and that we deserved to return to the type of work that we had chosen as our life's career, the pursuit of pure science and teaching. Moreover, it was not obvious in 1945 and 1946 that there was any need for a large effort on atomic weapons in peacetime. Teller passionately disagreed. He expressed himself as terribly pessimistic about relations with Russia. Better remembers of a conversation the two theoreticians had that winter. He was terribly anti-communist, terribly anti-Russian. Now, I knew that he had been anti-communist during the communist takeover in Hungary when he was about 11, but now it came out in a much more forceful way. Teller said we had to continue research on nuclear weapons. It was really wrong of all of us to want to leave. The war was not over, and Russia was just as dangerous an enemy as Germany had been. I just couldn't go along with that. I thought it was more important to go home and get the universities restarted, to train young physicists again. Beto was returning to Cornell. Oppenheimer had offers from every direction. He turned down Harvard in late September, believing, he wrote James Bryant Conant, that I would like to go back to California for the rest of my days. Fermi had accepted appointment to the faculty of the University of Chicago. Teller had been invited to work at Fermi's side. Leaving Los Alamos would mean leaving the super to others, but staying at Los Alamos would mean becoming part of what Oppenheimer, free once more to indulge in casual cruelty, was calling the second team. Norris Bradbury, the vigorous Berkeley-trained Navy physicist who had organized the assembly of the Trinity bomb, was replacing Oppenheimer as director. In the months immediately following the war, Bradbury recalled in 1948, the laboratory struggled for existence, and there is no better way to put it. Here was Los Alamos in September 1945. The senior civilian scientists, weary of living under wartime conditions, under wartime security, on a wartime army post, and under conditions of wartime urgency, thought longingly of their academic laboratories and classrooms. The more junior civilians thought of the academic degrees they did not have and the further education they ought to have. There was even no agreement as to what sort of future should be planned for Los Alamos. There was one school of thought which held that Los Alamos should become a monument, a ghost laboratory, and that all work on the military use of atomic energy should cease. Another group looked with increasing pessimism on the deterioration of our international relations and contended that Los Alamos should become a factory for atomic weapons. The majority agreed that, for the present at least, the United States required a research laboratory devoted to the study of fundamental nuclear physics and chemistry and their possible application to military use. Bradbury asked Teller to continue at Los Alamos as head of the theoretical division, the position Teller had believed he deserved when the laboratory was founded and that Oppenheimer had given to Bethe. Teller would sign on only if Bradbury promised major commitment in return. I said we either should make a great effort to build a hydrogen bomb in the shortest possible time or develop new models of fission explosives and speed progress by at least a dozen weapons tests a year. Bradbury said he would like to see either program, but that neither was realistic. There no longer was governmental support for weapons work. No one was interested. Either the new director was misinformed or Teller misrepresents his position. Jimmy Burns had charged Oppenheimer only a few weeks earlier to maintain full steam ahead. The immediate post-war problem at Los Alamos was not lack of support, but lack of authority. The Army had run the Manhattan Project in wartime. Now the work needed congressional authorization and funding, and that was slow in coming because it depended on legislation dealing with atomic energy, a revolutionary new field. To demand, as Teller did as a condition of his staying, writes Bethe, that Los Alamos tackle the super bomb on a large scale or plan for 12 tests a year on fission bombs was plainly unrealistic, to say the least. Teller went looking for Oppenheimer, seeking his advice and support. I told him about my conversation with Bradbury and then said, "This has been your laboratory and its future depends on you. I will stay if you will tell me that you will use your influence to help me accomplish either of my goals, if you will help enlist support for work toward a hydrogen bomb or further development of the atomic bomb." Oppenheimer's reply was quick. "I neither can nor will do so." It was obvious and clear to me that Oppenheimer did not want to support further weapons work in any way. It was equally obvious that only a man of Oppenheimer's stature could arouse governmental interest in either program. I was not willing to work without backing, and told Oppenheimer that I would go to Chicago. He smiled. "You are doing the right thing." Deke Parsons gave a party that night. Teller says Oppenheimer sought him out and asked him, "Now that you have decided to go to Chicago, don't you feel better?" Teller complained that he did not feel better. He felt that their work had been only a beginning. "We have done a wonderful job here," Oppenheimer countered, "and it will be many years before anyone can improve on our work in any way." The insensitivity of the remark rankled Teller as its ambiguity confused him. He would quote it frequently in the years after 1945, always to demonstrate its self-deception. It might have meant the Soviets will not soon build a bomb, or it might have meant the Oppenheimer team had accomplished in fission development what a Teller team could not soon improve in thermonuclear development. Teller would read it both ways, and liked neither reading. His immediate response was to take his problem to Fermi. Fermi apparently argued with him, consistent with the Interim Committee Scientific Panel letter of August 17th, that the solution to the problem of nuclear weapons must be a political solution. Fermi thought Teller was overly optimistic as well about the early prospects for a successful thermonuclear. Not only was thermonuclear burning itself a hard problem, the atomic bomb would also have to be better understood and considerably improved before it could be made efficient enough to serve as a thermonuclear trigger. But the two men were good friends, and Fermi encouraged Teller to write him a letter expressing his dissent. He would be happy to pass it along to the Secretary of War for the Interim Committee file. A year earlier, in the midst of war, James Bryant Conant had visited Los Alamos and talked to Teller about the super. Teller had predicted then, as Conant reported to Vannevar Bush, that the super was probably at least as distant now as was the fission bomb when I first heard of the enterprise. That estimate, between 4 and 5 years, was already optimistic compared to Fermi's. Now, in October 1945, Teller set it as an upper limit. He also first stated for the record many of the arguments for pursuing technological security that he would elaborate in the decades to come. When, he asked in the question-and-answer format he adopted, could the first super bomb be tried out? He answered with 2 numbers, the second an early example of what has come to be called threat inflation. It is my belief that 5 years is a conservative estimate of this time. This assumes that the development will be pursued with some vigor. The job, however, may be much easier than expected and may take no more than 2 years. In considering future dangers, it is important not to disregard this eventuality. How soon could another country produce such a super bomb? Faster than the United States, Teller apparently thought, despite his adopted nation's commanding technological and industrial lead. The time needed may not be much longer than the time needed by them to produce an atomic bomb. What about moral objections? They were meaningless before the onrush of technology. There is among my scientific colleagues some hesitancy as to the advisability of this development on the grounds that it might make the international problems even more difficult than they are now. My opinion is that this is a fallacy. If the development is possible, it is out of our powers to prevent it. Teller thought that civil defense measures, such as the dispersal of cities, might prove effective against atomic bombs, but very much less so against super bombs. He could not yet offer detailed plans for the peaceful use of thermonuclear explosives. But I consider it a certainty that the super bomb will allow us to extend our power over natural phenomena far beyond anything we can at present imagine. He filed his dissent as he prepared to depart Los Alamos. Teller was not one to fight for lost causes. He might have stayed, but the first team was leaving. His wife was expecting their second child. He packed his grand piano and moved to a professorship at the University of Chicago to do physics with Enrico Fermi. For a few years he would find security in family and teaching and research. General Leslie R. Groves traveled to Los Alamos in mid-October to present a certificate of appreciation to the laboratory from the Secretary of War. Under a brilliant New Mexico sky, Alice Kimball Smith remembers, virtually the entire population of the mesa assembled for the outdoor ceremony on October 16th, Oppenheimer's last day as director. He still thought he would return to California and to teaching, but accepting the certificate, he struck the theme that would occupy the next full decade of his life. It is our hope that in years to come we may look at this scroll and all that it signifies with pride. Today that pride must be tempered with a profound concern. If atomic bombs are to be added as new weapons to the arsenals of a warring world, or to the arsenals of nations preparing for war, then the time will come when mankind will curse the names of Los Alamos and Hiroshima. The peoples of the world must unite or they will perish. This war that has ravaged so much of the earth has written these words. The atomic bomb has spelled them out for all men to understand. Other men have spoken them in other times, of other wars, of other weapons. They have not prevailed. There are some, misled by a false sense of human history, who hold that they will not prevail today. It is not for us to believe that. By our works we are committed to a world united before the common peril, in law and in humanity. Besides the certificate, the men and women of Los Alamos each received a memento that day. A sterling silver pin the size of a dime stamped with a large letter A framing the small word bomb. Before Oppenheimer rushed off to Washington to testify on atomic energy to House and Senate committees, a newspaper reporter asked him if the atomic bomb had any significant limitations. "The limitations lie in the fact that you don't want to be on the receiving end of one," he quipped. Then he ventured prophecy. "If you ask, can we make them more terrible? The answer is yes. If you ask, can we make a lot of them? The answer is yes. If you ask, can we make them terribly more terrible? The answer is probably." Time featured the remarks in its international section at the end of the month, with a photograph of Oppenheimer holding a pipe and looking persuasive. He was the smartest of the lot, the news magazine quoted an unnamed colleague on his behalf. The public romance had begun. I. Robbie returned to Columbia University, Eugene Wigner to Princeton, Louis Alvarez, Glenn Seaborg, and Emilio Segre to Berkeley, George Kistiakowsky to Harvard. Victor Weisskopf went to MIT. Stanislav Ulam briefly and unhappily tried UCLA, then came back to Los Alamos. James Chadwick and most of the British mission returned to Great Britain with pockets full of secrets. In September, the British had given a formal farewell party for their friends on the Hill, the Brobdingnagian log cabin of Fuller Lodge, jammed with men in black tie and even white tie and tails, and women in long gowns not completely aired of mothballs. Genia Pyles had cooked buckets of thick soup. Steak and kidney pie was served on paper plates. Winifred Moon supplied several hundred paper cartons of trifle, a dessert which she swore she would never look upon again without nausea. The Oppenheimers and the Pyleses sat at high table above the fray. The Chadwicks had not come out from Washington, and the convivial and sometimes bibulous James Tuck served as toastmaster. After dinner, Bernice Brode notes, the British staged an original pantomime based on Babes in the Woods. Good Uncle Winnie had sent his babes to join forces with Good Uncle Franklin to outwit bad uncles Adolf and Benito. All that befell the children on their hazardous journey to the unknown desert was acted out by the entire mission. The end, the grand finale, was a reenacting of the Trinity test with a stepladder for a high tower from which a pail of stuff was overturned, making flashes and bangs and clatters for several minutes. This was not entirely comprehensible to many of the women, but made a tremendous hit with the men, particularly some of the details of the bangs. It was indeed a real smash hit. Later they cleared the floor and danced, as they had danced so many Saturday nights in that strange wilderness retreat through the long years of war. Niels Bohr, resettled in the Carlsberg House of Honor in Copenhagen, wrote Oppenheimer on November 9th. "I was very sorry that I should not see you again before my return to Denmark, but due to difficulties in arranging passage for Margareta and me, we could not, as we had intended to, return to USA before the secret of the project was lifted, and then it was thought advisable that I no longer postponed my return to Denmark. I need not say how often Aga and I think of all the kindness you and Kitty showed us in these last eventful years, where your understanding and sympathy have meant so much to me, and how closely I feel connected with you in the hope that the great accomplishment may contribute decisively to bringing about harmonious relationships between nations. I trust that the whole matter is developing in a favorable way." It was not, as Bohr knew. There was loud talk in the United States of an atomic secret that America would keep and protect. How little might be secret was revealed that autumn and early winter in a series of reports of Soviet stirrings in the field. The War Department learned in the middle of September, writes the historian Herbert Weiss, that the Soviet authorities were compelling the commanders of the Czechoslovak army to give orders that all German plans, parts, models, and formulas regarding the use of atomic energy, rocket weapons, and radar be turned over to them. Russian infantry and technical troops occupied Yakimov and St. Joachimsthal, the town and the factory, the only place in Central Europe where at this time uranium was being produced. The old mine from the residues of which Martin Klaproth had first isolated the heavy gray metal he named uranium, the mine young Robert Oppenheimer had explored on a walking tour in 1921, had fallen into Soviet hands. An attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow warned on December 24th that the USSR is out to get the atomic bomb. This has been officially stated. The meager evidence available indicates that great efforts are being made and that super priority will be given to the enterprise. At home was incomprehension, Herbert York remembers. To most of us, Russia was as mysterious and remote as the other side of the moon, and not much more productive when it came to really new ideas or inventions. A common joke of the time said that the Russians could not surreptitiously introduce nuclear bombs in suitcases into the United States because they had not yet been able to perfect a suitcase. But if American leaders did not believe the Soviet Union could soon achieve an atomic bomb, what it would do otherwise and what were its motives had become a matter of intense debate within the U.S. government. Tragically, that debate obscured the deeper issue then confronting the world for the first time in history. Robert Oppenheimer had testified before Congress. He had begun to work his way into the corridors of power. Now, on a stormy Friday night at the beginning of November 1945, he stepped forward to examine the nuclear dilemma publicly. Freed from the constraints of the Los Alamos directorship, he spoke to 500 members of the Association of Los Alamos Scientists, a new political organization crowded into the larger movie theater on the Hill. An unrevised transcript preserves his words much as his listeners heard them. Thunder above the mesa orchestrated his bare reconnaissance. It framed anew the prospects Bohr had revealed and defined limitations and opportunities that have persisted into the present. I should like to talk tonight, if some of you have long memories, perhaps you will regard it as justified, as a fellow scientist, Oppenheimer began with humor, and at least as a fellow worrier about the fix we are in. Involved, he thought, were issues which are quite simple and quite deep. One of those issues for him was why scientists had built the atomic bomb. He listed a number of motives: fear that Nazi Germany would build it first, hope that it would shorten the war, curiosity, a sense of adventure, or so that the world might know what can be done and deal with it. But he thought the basic motivation was moral and political. When you come right down to it, the reason that we did this job is because it was an organic necessity. If you are a scientist, you cannot stop such a thing. If you are a scientist, you believe that it is good to find out how the world works, that it is good to find out what the realities are, that it is good to turn over to mankind at large the greatest possible power to control the world and to deal with it according to its lights and its values. It is not possible to be a scientist unless you believe that the knowledge of the world and the power which this gives is a thing which is of intrinsic value to humanity, and that you are using it to help in the spread of knowledge and are willing to take the consequences. The defining trust in the value of knowledge that Oppenheimer ascribes here to science echoes Bohr's succinct formulation of the value of openness. The very fact that knowledge is itself the basis of civilization points directly to openness as the way to overcome the present crisis. Long before them, Thomas Jefferson, secure in his understanding of the core principles of democracy, professed a similar conviction. "I know no safe depository of the ultimate powers of the society but the people themselves," he wrote late in life. "And if we think them not enlightened enough to exercise that control with a wholesome discretion, the remedy is not to take it from them, but to inform their discretion." Oppenheimer went on to examine the political changes he believed the new weapons challenged mankind to explore. "But I think the advent of the atomic bomb, and the facts which will get around that they are not too hard to make, that they will be universal if people wish to make them universal, that they will not constitute a real drain on the economy of any strong nation, and that their power of destruction will grow and is already incomparably greater than that of any other weapon. I think these things create a new situation, so new that there is some danger, even some danger in believing that what we have is a new argument for arrangements, for hopes that existed before this development took place. By that I mean that much as I like to hear advocates of a world federation or advocates of a United Nations organization who have been talking of these things for years, much as I like to hear them say that here is a new argument, I think that they are in part missing the point, because the point is not that atomic weapons constitute a new argument. There have always been good arguments. The point is that atomic weapons constitute also a field, a new field, and a new opportunity for realizing preconditions. I think when people talk of the fact that this is not only a great peril, but a great hope, this is what they should mean. The simple fact that in this field, because it is a threat, because it is a peril, there exists a possibility of realizing, of beginning to realize, those changes which are needed if there is to be any peace. Those are very far-reaching changes. They are changes in the relations between nations, not only in spirit, not only in law, but also in conception and feeling. I don't know which of these is prior. They must all work together, and only the gradual interaction of one or the other can make a reality. I don't agree with those who say the first step is to have a structure of international law. I don't agree with those who say the only thing is to have friendly feelings. All of these things will be involved. I think it is true to say that atomic weapons are a peril which affects everyone in the world, and in that sense a completely common problem, as common a problem as it was for the Allies to defeat the Nazis. Solving that common problem, he continued, could serve as a pilot plant for a new type of international collaboration. I speak of it as a pilot plant because it is quite clear that the control of atomic weapons cannot be in itself the unique end of such operation. The only unique end can be a world that is united, and a world in which war will not occur. Half a century of circumscribed and often cynical negotiations for arms control has not altered Oppenheimer's essential point, which was Bohr's hopeful vision first of the complementarity of the bomb. Next he discussed what Bohr would have called the necessity of renunciation. Oppenheimer offered an American analogy. The one point I want to hammer home is what an enormous change in spirit is involved. There are things which we hold very dear, and I think rightly hold very dear. I would say that the word democracy perhaps stood for some of them as well as any other word. There are many parts of the world in which there is no democracy. There are other things which we hold dear, and which we rightly should. And when I speak of a new spirit in international affairs, I mean that even to these deepest of things which we cherish and for which Americans have been willing to die, and certainly most of us would be willing to die, even in those deepest things we realize that there is something more profound than that. Namely, the common bond with other men everywhere. It is only if you do that that this makes sense, because if you approach the problem and say, we know what is right and we would like to use the atomic bomb to persuade you to agree with us, then you are in a very weak position. I want to express the utmost sympathy with the people who have to grapple with this problem, and in the strongest terms to urge you not to underestimate its difficulty. I can think of an analogy. In the days in the first half of the 19th century, there were many people, mostly in the North, but some in the South, who thought that there was no evil on earth more degrading than human slavery, and nothing that they would more willingly devote their lives to than its eradication. Always when I was young, I wondered why it was that when Lincoln was president, he did not declare that the war against the South, when it broke out, was a war that slavery should be abolished, that this was the central point, the rallying point of that war. Lincoln was severely criticized by many of the abolitionists, as you know, by many then called radicals, because he seemed to be waging a war which did not hit the thing that was most important. But Lincoln realized, and I have only in the last months come to appreciate the depth and wisdom of it, that beyond the issue of slavery was the issue of the community of the people of this country, and the issue of the Union. In order to preserve the Union, Lincoln had to subordinate the immediate problem of the eradication of slavery and trust, and I think if he had had his way it would have gone so, to the conflict of those ideas in the united people to eradicate it. For such understanding, Oppenheimer celebrated Bohr, who was here so much during the difficult days, who had many discussions with us, and who helped us reach the conclusion that a universal renunciation of the use of force was not only a desirable solution, but that it was the unique solution, that there were no other alternatives. Little more in Oppenheimer's talk that stormy night carries weight down the years. Practical matters of legislation, counsel to his fellow scientists to accept responsibility for the consequences of their work. In closing, he delivered a final burst of realism about a timetable for change. I'm not sure that the greatest opportunities for progress do not lie somewhat further in the future than I had for a long time thought. The plain fact is that in the actual world and with the actual people in it, it has taken time, and it may take longer to understand what this is all about. And I'm not sure, as I have said before, that in other lands it won't take longer than it does in this country. These basic questions engaged men in 1945. They engage us still, as if the clock had stopped, while only the machinery of armament with terrible and terribly more terrible weapons has kept on running. Edward Teller returned to Los Alamos in April 1946 to chair a secret conference. Its purpose, according to a subsequent report, was to review work that has been done on the Super for completeness and accuracy and to make suggestions concerning further work that would be needed in this field if actual construction and test of the Super were planned. John von Neumann, Stanislav Ulam, and Norris Bradbury attended the conference, as did Emil Konopinski, John Manley, Philip Morrison, Canadian theoretician J. Carson Mark, and a crowd of other participants. One whose presence would vitally affect U.S. nuclear weapons policy later was Klaus Fuchs. The Super Conference examined only one design for a thermonuclear weapon, the design Teller and his group had developed during the war, the so-called classical Super, with an estimated explosive force of 10 million tons TNT equivalent, 10 megatons. The ingredients for the classical Super would be an atomic bomb, a cubic meter of liquid deuterium, and an indefinite amount of the rare second isotope of hydrogen, tritium, which, because of its short 12.26-year half-life, does not normally exist in nature but can be created in a nuclear reactor by bombarding lithium with neutrons. How these components would have been arranged in the classical Super is still secret. Probably spherically, the fission trigger and hydrogen isotopes physically contiguous and contained within a heavy tamper. It is likely the conference decided on the basis of the Teller Group's calculations that a super bomb can be constructed and will work. Definite proof of this can hardly ever be expected, and a final decision can be made only by a test of the completely assembled super bomb. The conference called for a detailed calculation to study mathematically the probable progress of the explosion. The hand calculations that Teller and his group had made to arrive at the classical Super were necessarily, given the complexity of the problem, rough and incomplete. The conference also found that Teller's design was on the whole workable. Some participants had doubts. Should the doubts prove well-founded, simple modifications of the design will render the model feasible. In conclusion, the undertaking of the new and important super bomb project would necessarily involve a considerable fraction of the resources which are likely to be devoted to work on atomic developments in the next years. We feel it appropriate to point out that further decision in a matter so filled with the most serious implications as is this one can properly be taken only as part of the highest national policy. In June 1946, 3 months after the Super Conference, the U.S. nuclear weapons stockpile consisted of only 9 Fat Man bombs, of which no more than 7 could be made operational for lack of initiators. The stockpile held only 13 bombs a year later, 2 years after the end of the war. Plutonium production was the crucial bottleneck. The high neutron flux of the Hanford production piles had proven damaging. One had been unloaded in May to prevent further damage, and the other damped back to 80% of its full capacity. Anything Los Alamos could do, therefore, to improve fission bomb design would significantly bolster the U.S. nuclear arsenal at a time of increasing conflict with the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, about half the theoretical division's time between 1946 and 1950 went to the Super. Atomic bombs by then were a matter more of engineering than of theoretical physics, to be sure, but the complexities of the thermonuclear problem also tantalized. There ensued a curious period of optimism in Teller's life. His wife Mickey bore him a second child, a daughter, in the summer of 1946, and he found more time for his family. he was caught up again in the grandeur and the deeply satisfying creativity of basic science. The years after Los Alamos, writes Eugene Wigner, and until the renewal of his preoccupation with national security were perhaps Teller's most fruitful years scientifically. Teller taught, co-authored 13 scientific papers, regularly visited Los Alamos to consult, wrote articles for the new Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. In the bulletin, he called for an end to secrecy where purely scientific data are concerned. He praised as ingenious, daring, and basically sound the Acheson-Lilienthal report that became the basis of the Baruch Plan for international control of nuclear weapons that the United States offered to the United Nations in 1946. He recognized the absolutes of the absolute weapon in April 1946, the same month as the Super Conference, in a surprising profession of faith. Nothing that we can plan as a defense for the next generation is likely to be satisfactory. That is, nothing but world union. A year later, he still saw no defense against atomic weapons. He described with compassionate horror the terrible devastation of Hiroshima. One is struck by the picture of fires raging unopposed, wounds remaining unattended, sick men killing themselves with the exertions of helping their fellows. It was even possible to imagine, he wrote, that the effects of an atomic war will endanger the survival of man. He thought in December 1947, in the wake of Soviet rejection of the Baruch Plan, that agreement with the Russians still seems possible. The Danes, he noted waggishly, were once similarly imperialistic and ambitious. We must now work for world law and world government. Even if Russia should not join immediately, a successful, powerful, and patient world government may secure their cooperation in the long run. We scientists have two clear-cut duties, to work on atomic energy and to work for world government, which alone can give us freedom and peace. The extreme swings in Edward Teller's outlook remain somewhat mysterious. The British theoretician Freeman Dyson, then one of Teller's students, wrote his family from post-war Chicago that his teacher, whom he liked and admired, was nevertheless a good example of the saying that no man is so dangerous as an idealist. The emotional timbre of Teller's Chicago period writing differs notably from his later work. It is less choleric and more optimistic, of course, but a deeper difference is that it is informed by a much greater degree of trust in his fellow man and in the possibility that human institutions might serve to restrain the conflicts of nations. Even Russia became, for a time, this fabulous monster, not the threatening presence Teller described to Bethe in 1945, and would invoke with increasing urgency in the years after 1949. World government, he wrote in the Bulletin as late as July 1948, is our only hope for survival. I believe that we should cease to be infatuated with the menace of this fabulous monster, Russia. Our present necessary task of opposing Russia should not cause us to forget that in the long run we cannot win by working against something. We must work for something. We must work for world government. The reasons for this difference of attitude must be partly personal and inaccessible, perhaps even to the man himself. But it would appear from subsequent events that a crucial reason for Teller's sense of security in the immediate post-war years was America's sole possession of the atomic bomb. But hardly anyone was listening. The Cold War had begun in earnest. Oppenheimer had found his way into the high councils of government. Now director of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton and chairman of the Scientific General Advisory Committee of the newly established U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, he was internationally famous, a household name. A plaintive footnote in a 1948 Teller Bulletin review of the first year's work of the Atomic Energy Commission reveals the Hungarian physicist's isolation from power in those days. Due to the limited experience of the author, the account is necessarily incomplete. In the early summer of 1949, Teller returned to Los Alamos on leave of absence from Chicago. He did not easily wrench himself away. Oppenheimer had sought him out and encouraged him. Bradbury had then sent a delegation that included Stanislav Ulam to invite him back. He said later he went because he had decided that his writing, public speaking, and political action were less than productive, and that the best contribution I could make would be to go back to Los Alamos to help develop weapons, something I knew about and that could yield concrete results. He was undoubtedly influenced by the Soviet coup in Czechoslovakia in the winter of 1948, by the blockade of Berlin that began the following summer, and by the impending communist victory over nationalist forces in China. A more personal challenge was the fate of Hungary, which had briefly experienced democratic government once more as a republic under the protection of the Allied Control Commission. But the Red Army remained in occupation, and by 1948 the Communist Party had maneuvered itself into power. A one-slate election on May 15, 1949, finished the job. Teller's father, mother, sister, and nephew had survived the destruction of Hungarian Jewry and still lived in Budapest. Now they were cut off from him. Teller was thus back at weapons work when Harry Truman announced on September 23, 1949, the explosion of Joe 1, the first Soviet atomic bomb. Like most Americans, Teller had not expected the Soviet success so soon. He called Oppenheimer on the day the Soviet test was announced in a state of arousal sufficient to cause Oppenheimer to advise him sharply, "Keep your shirt on." He testified later that his mind did not immediately turn in the direction of working on the thermonuclear bomb, but in fact he discussed that prospect intensely at Los Alamos early in October with Ernest Lawrence and Luis Alvarez, who encouraged him. The American nuclear monopoly had ended. The fabulous monster had real claws. If the Soviet Union had tested an atomic bomb, could a Soviet hydrogen bomb be far behind? Teller decided that the only possible hope for continued national security was an all-out American effort to build the super. The first concrete act of the United States government in response to the Soviet Union's demonstrated mastery of explosive fission was to approve, in October 1949, a program to expand the production of uranium and plutonium. In the meantime, a secret debate raged within the government. What should the United States do? Herbert York, at the time a Teller protege, describes the debate's constituents. Especially considering the enormity of the issue, and most of those involved were fully aware of its enormity, the participants in the secret debate were very few. The members of the GAC, the AEC's General Advisory Committee, the members of the AEC and a few of their staff, the members of the Senate and House Joint Committee on Atomic Energy, and a few of their staff, a very few top officials in the Defense Department, and a very small group of concerned scientists. Altogether, there were less than 100 people, most of whom thought of themselves, probably correctly, as being involved in making one of the most fateful decisions of all time. Another crucial figure in the debate was Dean Acheson, now Secretary of State. Truman listened to Acheson, Secretary of Defense Lewis Johnson, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff more than he listened to the scientists. The Joint Chiefs told Truman, without much staff evaluation, that a Soviet H-bomb would be intolerable. So, in as many words, did Acheson. None of the groups that participated in the debate studied the possibility that the result of the American initiative might be an arms race. The H-bomb appeared to its supporters to offer a return to nuclear superiority. On January 31, 1950, Truman announced in favor of proceeding to develop it. Teller took the president's decision as a personal victory. Since at least the September afternoon of Oppenheimer's blunt advice to keep his shirt on, he seems to have felt that his fellow physicist was personally attempting to impede him. Oppenheimer was chairman of the GAC, which had been asked in October to advise the AEC commissioners in the matter. Teller went to Washington to lobby past that committee. Among others, he talked to Kenneth D. Nichols, now a general and with Gross's retirement the Army's resident nuclear weapons expert. One autumn Sunday morning on Nichols's front porch, Teller argued so emotionally that Nichols finally challenged him. "Edward, why are you worrying about the situation so much?" "I'm not really worrying about the situation," Nichols remembers Teller responding. "I'm worrying about the people who should be worrying about it." The GAC met on October 29th and 30th. Oppenheimer, Conant, Fermi, Robbie, Caltech President Lee Dubridge, metallurgist Cyril Smith, Bell Laboratories President Oliver E. Buckley, engineer Hartley Rowe, Glenn Seaborg absent. It recommended in response to the Soviet achievement that the AEC look further into increasing the production of fissionable materials. It called for an intensification of efforts to make atomic weapons available for tactical purposes. It proposed building facilities to produce more neutrons for weapons research and development. and it strongly recommended pursuing an existing Los Alamos program to use small quantities of tritium in atomic bombs to boost those bombs to more efficient and more powerful explosions, an invention that was successfully tested in May 1951. But the committee also recommended against pursuing with high priority the development of the superbomb. It based its recommendation on essentially two arguments: that at 10 megatons a super would be a weapon of mass destruction only, with no other apparent military use, and that it would not obviously improve the security of the United States. It would not do so in particular because the design then under consideration, the design reviewed at the Super Conference in 1946, Teller's design, the classical super, looked as if it would require large amounts of tritium, and plutonium and tritium, both created in nuclear reactors, would compete for existing plant capacity. Tritium was, as well, 80 times as expensive to make gram for gram as plutonium. The U.S. nuclear stockpile in late 1949 consisted of about 200 atomic bombs. Slowing production of bombs that worked for a new weapon that might not work made no sense to the scientists and engineers of the GAC. As Oppenheimer summarized in later testimony, the H-bomb program we had in 1949 was a tortured thing that you could well argue did not make a great deal of technical sense. It was therefore possible to argue also that you did not want it even if you could have it. The GAC members divided themselves into a majority and a minority to write explanatory annexes to their October 30th report. Conant drafted the majority annex, which Oppenheimer, DeBridge, Rowe, Smith, and Buckley signed. It said that a super might become a weapon of genocide. It said such a bomb should never be produced. To the argument that the Russians may succeed in developing this weapon, we should reply that our undertaking it will not prove a deterrent to them. Should they use the weapon against us, reprisals by our large stock of atomic bombs would be comparably effective to the use of a super. Robbie drafted the minority annex, which he and Fermi signed. It argued that the H-bomb question might serve as a springboard for new arms control efforts. It described the super as a weapon which in practical effect is almost one of genocide, then for good measure went even further in condemnation. It is an evil thing considered in any light. Teller had been the leading proponent of this enormously powerful weapon since before Pearl Harbor. His Manhattan Project colleagues on the GAC, Oppenheimer, Conant, Fermi, Robbie, Smith, had encouraged him and even worked alongside him. Nothing was said then of evil, of genocide. They who had won high position building weapons used in the mass destruction of 2 Japanese cities now condemned another, more ingenious weapon. They who were scientists and understood that kindling a sustained thermonuclear reaction on the Earth was a historic experiment in fundamental physics proposed the indefinite postponement of that experiment, thus probably handing the triumph gratuitously to the Russians. A courier delivered a copy of the committee's report to Los Alamos in advance of a delegation of interested congressmen who had already seen it. With AEC Chairman David Lilienthal's approval, John Manley, Associate Director of the Laboratory and Executive Secretary of the GAC, showed it to division heads, including Teller. Edward was, of course, just completely aghast, Manley recalls, and his reaction was to offer me a bet that if we did not proceed immediately with a crash program on the super, he would be a prisoner of war of the Russians in the United States. Teller explained his reaction to a Time Life interviewer in 1954, using an ironic variation of the argument he accepted from Oppenheimer in 1945 when he rejected Szilard's petition. The reasons they gave just made me mad. The important thing in any science is to do the things that can be done. Scientists naturally have a right and a duty to have opinions, but their science gives them no special insight into public affairs. There is a time for scientists and movie stars and people who have flown the Atlantic to restrain their opinions lest they be taken more seriously than they should be. It is sometimes difficult, even for other scientists, to remember that the atomic and hydrogen bombs were developed not only as weapons of terrible destruction. They were also, as Fermi once said, superb physics. At the time of the Truman announcement, J. Carson Mark headed the theoretical division at Los Alamos. Truman's words, Mark comments, didn't necessarily mean we did anything much different from what we had been doing because we really didn't know how to make a gadget that would work as a hydrogen bomb. In February 1950, when Washington learned that for 7 crucial years, from 1942 to 1949, Klaus Fuchs had passed along secret information to the Soviet Union, Truman turned to a special committee of the National Security Council for advice. The committee recommended that the President clarify his somewhat vague January 31st directive to put energetic development of a hydrogen bomb clearly on record. It emphasized at the same time that there was no obvious way to speed up the weapons test schedule and no guarantee of success. Truman promulgated the committee's report as official policy. The necessary next step toward a workable thermonuclear weapon was elaborate mathematical simulation. Without a mathematical model of the evolution of thermonuclear burning from a fission trigger event, Mark explains, no conclusive evidence was possible short of a successful stab in the dark, since a test failure would not necessarily establish unfeasibility, but possibly only that the system chosen, Teller's classical super, for example, was unsuitable. The super problem, as the simulation came to be called, was the largest mathematical effort ever undertaken up to that time. Vastly larger, writes Stanislav Ulam, than any astronomical calculation done to that date on hand computers. It involved calculating the blooming of a thermonuclear explosion, its heating, its extremely complex hydrodynamics, its evolving physical reactions, in progressive increments of less than 1/10,000,000th of a second. The 1946 Super Conference had called for such calculations, but until the further development of the electronic computer, they simply could not be accomplished in any reasonable period of time. Teller said as much in a September 1947 report discussing choosing between his classical super and an alternative design. I think that the decision whether considerable effort is to be put on the development of the TX-14 or the super should be postponed for approximately 2 years, namely until such time as these experiments, tests, and calculations have been carried out. In late 1949, before the H-bomb decision, Los Alamos began detailed work preparing a machine calculation for the first primitive electronic computer, the ENIAC, at the Aberdeen Proving Grounds in Maryland. After the H-bomb decision, Ulam and the Theoretical Division's Cornelius J. Everett decided to go ahead by hand with a simplified version of the calculation. We started to work each day for 4 to 6 hours with slide rule, pencil, and paper, Ulam remembers, making frequent quantitative guesses. Much of our work was done by guessing values of geometrical factors, imagining intersections of solids, estimating volumes, and estimating chances of points escaping. We did this repeatedly for hours, liberally sprinkling the guesses with constant slide rule calculations. It was long and arduous work. They were calculating part 1 of a 2-part problem, trying to see if a fission trigger heating a specified amount of deuterium and tritium would start a thermonuclear reaction. Teller's group had calculated a cruder version of part 1 between 1944 and 1946. By February 1950, Ulam saw that the amount of tritium Teller had estimated earlier was not nearly sufficient. The result of the calculations, Ulam reported, seems to be that the model considered is a fizzle. He increased the estimated tritium volume and began again. Even with more tritium, Teller's classical super looked distinctly unpromising. Late in April, Ulam went off to Princeton to discuss his pessimistic results with von Neumann and Fermi. The 3 men talked with Oppenheimer as well. Ulam noticed that he seemed rather glad to learn of the difficulties. Ulam returned to Los Alamos and broke the news to Teller. He was pale with fury yesterday, literally, Ulam reported to von Neumann, but I think is calmed down today. Teller at first refused to believe the calculations. He also questioned Ulam's motives for performing them. According to the official AEC history, it was necessary for von Neumann to offer Teller reassurances that the motives behind the changes in tritium estimates were constructive. Ironically, Ulam had favored building the super from the beginning. The super problem went on the ENIAC on schedule in June. The evolving results confirmed Ulam's and Everett's findings. In the course of the calculation, Ulam recalls, in spite of an initial hopeful-looking flare-up, the whole assembly started slowly to cool down. Every few days, Johnny von Neumann would call in some results. "Icicles are forming," he would say dejectedly. At the same time, Ulam and Fermi, who was visiting Los Alamos for the summer, began hand-calculating the next phase of the super problem, which concerned the propagation of the initial thermonuclear reaction. That work, says Ulam, turned out to be basic to the technology of thermonuclear explosions. It also predicted that Teller's super would fizzle. The super was simply a bad design, Hans Bethe explains, a dead end. That Ulam's calculations had to be done at all was proof that the H-bomb project was not ready for a crash program when Teller first advocated such a program in the fall of 1949. Nobody will blame Teller because the calculations of 1946 were wrong, especially because adequate computing machines were not then available. But he was blamed at Los Alamos for leading the laboratory, and indeed the whole country, into an adventurous program on the basis of calculations which he himself must have known to have been very incomplete. The technical skepticism of the GAC, on the other hand, had turned out to be far more justified than the GAC itself had dreamed in October 1949. Between October 1950 and January 1951, Bethe goes on, Teller was desperate. He proposed a number of complicated schemes to save the classical super, none of which seemed to show much promise. It was evident that he did not know of any solution. He was nevertheless unwilling to retrench. He wanted most of the laboratory's time for at least another year and a half. He did not know how to make a thermonuclear, he told the GAC at an October meeting, but he was convinced it could be done. He insisted that the bottleneck was a lack of theoreticians at Los Alamos and a lack of imagination. If the greenhouse tests of thermonuclear feasibility scheduled for the spring of 1951 at Eniwetok Atoll in the Marshall Islands proved the hydrogen bomb impossible, he concluded, Los Alamos might be strong enough to continue. If the tests proved a bomb possible, the laboratory might not be strong enough to follow through. Teller's assessment won him few friends at Los Alamos. Severe stress can be creative, so can long familiarity with a problem. By February 1951, Ulam was angry with Teller, and Teller was angry with everyone. The result was a novel, entirely unexpected invention. Not even Teller had anticipated it. Bethe supplies a context for lay assessment. The new concept was to me, who had been rather closely associated with the program, about as surprising as the discovery of fission had been to physicists in 1939. The concept has come to be called the Teller-Ulam configuration. Afterward, Teller would variously deny, acknowledge, and claim credit for Ulam's contribution. Ulam would consistently acknowledge Teller's part, but quietly insist upon his own. Others, Lothar Nordheim of the Theoretical Division, Herbert York, confirm, as Nordheim wrote in 1954 to the New York Times, that a general principle was formulated by Dr. Stanislav Ulam in collaboration with Teller, who shortly afterward gave it its technically practical form. Teller's most nearly generous acknowledgment appears in his 1955 essay, The Work of Many People. Two signs of hope came within a few weeks. One sign was an imaginative suggestion by Ulam. The other sign was a fine calculation by physicist Friedrich de Hoffmann. His unwillingness consistently to acknowledge Ulam's contribution, in contradiction of scientific ethics, suggests the importance he attached to historic rank in the matter. He came to dislike being called the father of the H-bomb, but asserted his paternity in 1954 with a curiously explicit allegory of his on-again, off-again relationship with Los Alamos. It is true that I am the father in the biological sense that I performed a necessary function and let nature take its course. After that, a child had to be born. It might be robust or it might be stillborn, but something had to be born. The process of conception was by no means a pleasure. It was filled with difficulty and anxiety for both parties. My act aroused the emotions associated with such behavior. Bethe sifts the evidence the other way, drolly tongue-in-cheek. I used to say that Ulam was the father of the hydrogen bomb and Edward was the mother because he carried the baby for quite a while. The mechanism of the Teller-Ulam H-bomb was revealed in general terms in an official Los Alamos publication in 1983, on the occasion of the 40th anniversary of the laboratory's founding. The first megaton-yield explosives, hydrogen bombs, were based on the application of X-rays produced by a primary nuclear device to compress and ignite a physically distinct secondary nuclear assembly. The process by which the time-varying radiation source is coupled to the secondary is referred to as radiation transport. Stanislav Ulam's basic contribution appears to have emerged from a closer look at the early development of the fission fireball, which initially radiates most of its energy as X-rays. These, traveling at the speed of light, advance outward ahead of any shock wave. The classical super and other previous designs presumably tried to pack the entire mass of thermonuclear material into the evolving fission explosion to heat it hydrodynamically, more spheres within spheres, a fatter and unworkable fat man. Those designs always promised to blow apart before thermonuclear burning could make much headway. Ulam suddenly realized, it seems, that if the thermonuclear materials were physically separated from the fission primary, the enormous flux of X-rays coming off the primary might be applied somehow to start thermonuclear burning in the brief fraction of a second before the slower shock wave caught up and blew everything apart. Ulam and Teller proceeded to develop Ulam's idea. The X-rays from the primary might heat the thermonuclear secondary directly, as microwaves heat food in a microwave oven, but they could not squeeze it efficiently to the greater density that would promote fusion. Some other material would need to intervene. It turned out that ordinary plastic would serve. Dump so large a flux of X-rays into a layer of dense plastic foam wrapped around the cylindrical stick of thermonuclear materials, and the plastic would heat instantaneously to a plasma, a hot ionized gas, expanding explosively at pressures thousands of times more intense than the pressures high explosives can generate. So a fission primary, a little fat man no larger in today's efficient weapons than a soccer ball, might occupy one end of an evacuated cylindrical casing. Farther along the casing, a layer of plastic might wrap a cylindrical arrangement of thermonuclear material. Fire the primary, and the X-ray flux would radiate into the plastic at the speed of light, much faster than the expanding fission shock wave coming up behind. Configuring the plastic would be much simpler than configuring high-explosive lenses. The light-swift X-rays would irradiate it simultaneously along its entire length, and the resulting implosion would be beautifully symmetrical. That, to the extent that continuing secrecy allows its reconstruction, is probably what Ulam first conceived and Teller made practical. Though it was the necessary breakthrough, it was not the end of invention. Even with the greater heat and pressure of irradiated plastic implosion, the design apparently would not evolve sufficient heat long enough to kindle a full-scale thermonuclear reaction. Such reactions depend on heating light atoms such as deuterium and tritium, increasing their velocity of motion sufficiently to force them through the electrical barrier of the nucleus so that they can fuse to helium. The process requires heat and pressure but no critical mass. Once fusion has begun, the binding energy released in the reaction, for deuterium and tritium, 17.6 million electron volts, promotes further burning. A fusion weapon can therefore be made arbitrarily large, as a fire can be made arbitrarily large by piling on more fuel. But first it must be well started, and the arrangement Ulam and Teller initially proposed apparently was not yet sufficient to do the job. On March 9, 1951, Betta notes, Teller and Ulam published a classified paper which contained one-half the new concept. But within a month, Betta goes on, the very important second half of the new concept occurred to Teller and was given preliminary checks by Frederick de Hoffmann. This immediately became the main focus of attention of the thermonuclear design program. The second half of the new concept was probably a further nesting of cylinders within cylinders. An outside casing of U-238 to scatter X-rays from the primary into the plastic, a layer next of plastic, a layer next of U-238 tamper, a layer next of thermonuclear materials, and at the axis of the cylinder a stick of plutonium. Now the imploding plastic would work not only on the thermonuclear materials, it would also start a second fission chain reaction in the stick of plutonium by squeezing it to critical mass. That would add a further huge flux of heat and pressure to the thermonuclear materials and push the fusion reactions over the top. The U-238 later, in turn, would benefit from the dense flux of neutrons released in thermonuclear burning and would fission above the 1 million electron-volt U-238 fission threshold. Neutrons from that fission would then contribute to preparing the thermonuclear materials for further burning. In modern dry bombs, by making tritium from lithium-6 deuteride. Such a design is usually described as fission-fusion-fission. Not without reason did Robert Oppenheimer call the two-part Teller-Ulam invention technically sweet. The Institute for Advanced Study director, among others, hailed the invention as a breakthrough. Dr. Oppenheimer warmly supported this new approach, Teller testifies, and I understand that he made a statement to the effect that if anything of this kind had been suggested right away, i.e. at the time of the 1949 H-bomb debate, he would never have opposed it. Work on a thermonuclear advanced rapidly at Los Alamos through 1951, but by then Teller's relationships had deteriorated to the point of no return. 3 years later, in a time of trial, Oppenheimer would note on a yellow pad a damning remark of Teller's that summarized the Hungarian physicist's turnabout from proponent of world government to aggressive weaponeer, a remark that echoes all the way back to his traumatic experience of revolution and counter-revolution in the Hungary of his youth. "Since I cannot work with the appeasers, I will work with the fascists." Someone heard E.T. say this. Who? In 1952, with Ernest Lawrence's support and Defense Department backing, Teller won a second weapons laboratory in the Livermore Valley, 50 miles inland from Berkeley. Los Alamos was left to build the first experimental thermonuclear device, banally coded Mike. Teller chose not to attend the Mike shot at Eniwetok on November 1, 1952. He was busy starting up his new weapons laboratory and could hardly spare the time. He certainly also felt unwelcome. The Mike device was fueled with liquid tritium and deuterium. The liquids required a cryogenic refrigeration plant to maintain their low temperature. The complex assembly weighed some 65 tons and occupied an entire laboratory building on the small island of Elugalab. Shrouded in black tar paper, shimmering in the heat, the cubic building looked in the distance like a diabolic twin to the Kaaba of Mecca. Teller contrived nevertheless to follow the progress of the test. He stationed himself at a seismograph in a basement room of the Berkeley Geology Building. Herbert York, acting director at Livermore, tuned a shortwave radio to the frequency of the Mike shot telemetry. When the shot was fired, he called Teller in Berkeley. The two physicists had calculated the time a seismic wave from a successful shot would require to travel under the Pacific Basin to Northern California. About 15 minutes, Teller remembers. I watched with little patience, the seismograph making at each minute a clearly visible vibration that served as a time signal. At last the time signal came that had to be followed by the shock from the explosion, and there it seemed to be. The luminous point appeared to dance wildly and irregularly. Was it only that the pencil which I held as a marker trembled in my hand? Mike was expected to explode with an energy of a few megatons, but its designers had engineered every component to maximize its yield. It yielded 10.4 million tons TNT equivalent, 1,000 times more violent than Little Boy. "This thing is the plague of Thebes," Oppenheimer once complained of the H-bomb. Now the plague found incarnation. The test was secret. No report would reach Los Alamos until security officers on Eniwetok had had time to examine and encode it. Teller knew Mike had worked before its builders did. He dictated a telegram to York to send on to Los Alamos. The message was brief but barbed. "It's a boy." The fireball, writes Leona Marshall Libby, expanded to 3 miles in diameter. Observers, all evacuated to 40 miles or more away, saw millions of gallons of atoll lagoon water, turned to steam, appear as a giant bubble. When the steam had evaporated, they saw that the island of Elugalab, where the bomb building had been, had vanished, vaporized also. In its place, a crater 1/2 mile deep and 2 miles wide had been torn in the reef. The Soviet Union exploded a device with a small hydrogen component. in August 1953. Its yield was probably several hundred kilotons, about half the yield of the largest fission weapon the United States had tested up to that time. "This was not a true H-bomb," Hans Bethe comments, "as I know very well because I was chairman of the committee analyzing the Russian fallout." At 65 tons, Mike was too large and complex a mechanism to serve as a deliverable bomb. Its designers had fueled it with liquid deuterium and tritium for simplicity in measuring the thermonuclear reactions it would test. For a deliverable bomb, the thermonuclear material of choice would be lithium deuteride, a stable powder, the lithium in the form of the isotope lithium-6, which constitutes 7.4% of natural lithium but can be separated from it relatively easily. Neutrons from the fission components of a lithium-fueled bomb would produce tritium almost instantly from lithium-6, which would then fuse with the deuteride to develop thermonuclear burning just as the wet and bulky liquid hydrogen isotopes had done in Mike. The dry design was tested during Operation Castle in the spring of 1954. "The very first test of the series," writes Herbert York, "the Bravo test, was of a device using LID as its fuel and yielding 15 megatons. It was in a form readily adaptable for delivery by aircraft and thus was the first large American hydrogen bomb." A true Soviet thermonuclear dropped from an aircraft in test followed on November 23, 1955. When Niels Bohr arrived at Los Alamos in 1943, writes Robert Oppenheimer, his first serious question was, is it really big enough? The bomb, Bohr meant. Big enough to end World War, big enough to challenge mankind to find its way beyond man-made death to a world more open and more humane. "I do not know whether it was," Oppenheimer adds. "It did finally get to be." By 1955, if not before, the bomb had worked an essential change upon the world. Oppenheimer had already found succinct metaphoric expression of that change in a commencement address he delivered early in 1946. "It did not take atomic weapons to make war terrible," he said then. "It did not take atomic weapons to make man want peace, a peace that would last. But the atomic bomb was the turn of the screw. It has made the prospect of future war unendurable. It has led us up those last few steps to the mountain pass, and beyond there is a different country." Gil Eliot's 20th Century Book of the Dead is a useful guide to that progress. Eliot is a Scottish writer of original mind who lives in London. It occurred to him to look into the question of how many human beings have died by man-made violence in this most bloody of centuries. He discovered that few historians or statisticians have bothered to count past the men in uniform. He worked out order-of-magnitude estimates and arrived at a total, including combatants, of about 100 million dead. He calls this uncelebrated multitude a nation of the dead. "We know as much about the nation of the dead as we might have known about any living nation 50 years ago when the techniques of social measurement were still at an early age. The population is around 100 million. A proper census has not yet been possible, but the latest estimate based on samples of the population suggests a figure of 110 million. That's about the size of it. A large modern nation. It's very much a 20th century nation, as cosmopolitan in its origins as the United States. The people have always been mixed, but the real growth began in 1914. Between then and the early 1920s, the population reached 20 million, and steady growth over the next 20 years brought it to almost 40 million by the outbreak of the Second World War. In the early 1940s, the population more than doubled, with annual increases reaching peaks of 10 to 12 million. Since 1945, the growth rate has declined below any previous levels since the late 1920s. This has been accompanied by a gigantic increase in the capacity for expansion. Eliot went on from counting to examine how this silent nation assembled itself, the manner of its murder. He found the weapons to have been hardware and privation, big guns, small arms in combat, small arms in massacre, aerial bombs, ghettos, camps, sieges, occupations, dislocations, famines, blockades. Behind the weapons, Eliot encountered a phenomenon more basic and more malign. The war machine's evolving across the decades into a total war machine, and the total war machine managing variously and intermittently to create areas of total death. Verdun, Leningrad, Auschwitz, Hiroshima. The most compact, efficient, inexpensive, inexorable mechanisms of total death are nuclear weapons. Since 1945, they have therefore come to dominate the field. The lesson we should learn from all this, I. Rabi remarks, and the frightening thing which we did learn in the course of the war was how easy it is to kill people when you turn your mind to it. When you turn the resources of modern science to the problem of killing people, you realize how vulnerable they really are. The change from a total war machine capable of gouging out pockets of total death in a living landscape to a total death machine capable of burning and blasting and poisoning and chilling the human world is Oppenheimer's turn of the screw. Eliot elaborates. The 100 million or so man-made deaths of the 20th century are more directly comparable with the scale of death from disease and plague which was the accepted norm before this century. Indeed, man-made death has largely replaced these as a source of untimely death. This is the kind of change that Hegel meant when he said that a quantitative change, if large enough, could bring about a qualitative change. The quality of this particular change becomes clear if we connect the present total of deaths with the scale of death inherent in the weapons now possessed by the large powers. Nuclear strategists talk in terms of hundreds of millions of deaths, of the destruction of whole nations, and even of the entire human race. Less efficient machines required 2/3 of a century to assemble a nation of the dead. The nuclear death machine could manage it in half an hour. The nuclear death machine has become capable of creating not merely cities of the dead or nations of the dead, but a world of the dead. Even before detailed studies appeared of the potentially widespread disaster known as nuclear winter, the World Health Organization had estimated in 1982 that a major nuclear war would kill half the population of the Earth, 2 billion people. Therefore, Eliot deduces, the moral significance is inescapable. If morality refers to relations between individuals or between the individual and society, then there can be no more fundamental moral issue than the continuing survival of individuals and societies. The scale of man-made death is the central moral as well as material fact of our time. This identifies what we are talking about, the modern phenomenon of total death, that is, not capitalism versus communism or democracy versus the police state, but does not explain how we arrived at the brink of so absolute an abyss. Eliot supplies a clue to the answer in his discussion of the First World War. The one thing that stands out overall, he observes, is that at no time before, during, or after the war was there a living organic structure in society, e.g. church, political party, custom, body of law, with sufficient strength to resist the new man-made and machine-made creation, organized death. War is ancient. That it traditionally exposes to maximum danger a biologically surplus and relatively powerless subset of the population, young males, suggests that in some circumstances of traditional intersocial conflict it confers reproductive advantage. Nor were mass slaughters ever rare. The Old Testament regularly celebrates their carnage. The histories of empires bulk thick with them. World war differed not only in scale but also in essential organization from such more limited earlier conflicts. Total death differs from the surround of mass slaughter in its time-dependent assembly line linearity. Both kinds of violence emerge from a distinctly modern process, the nation-state parasitizing applied science and industrial technology to protect itself and to further its ambitions. Though it dominates the world, the nation-state owns no long history of legitimacy. It developed in the 18th and 19th centuries, its nationalism a doctrine invented in Europe, writes the political scientist Elie Kaduri, that pretends to supply a criterion for the determination of the unit of population proper to enjoy a government exclusively its own. Briefly, the doctrine holds that humanity is naturally divided into nations, that nations are known by certain characteristics which can be ascertained, and that the only legitimate type of government is national self-government. Not the least triumph of this doctrine is that such propositions have become accepted and are thought to be self-evident, that the very word nation has been endowed by nationalism with a meaning and a resonance which until the end of the 18th century it was far from having. These ideas have become firmly naturalized in the political rhetoric of the West, which has been taken over for the use of the whole world. But what now seems natural once was unfamiliar, needing argument, persuasion, evidences of many kinds. What seems simple and transparent is really obscure and contrived, the outcome of circumstances now forgotten and preoccupations now academic, the residue of metaphysical systems sometimes incompatible and even contradictory. Nationalism differed radically from the hierarchical feudal organization that preceded it in the West. It offered every member of society who was included within its definition the security, invested with powerful emotion, of merger into a welcoming crowd. Not the king or the nobility, but the people would be its essential polity. L'État, c'est moi, et moi, et moi. That was the increase in political freedom its invention installed. But complementarily, notes the economist Barbara Ward, its essential nature is, as well, to leave other people out. It can even divorce from all community of brotherhood and goodwill fellow men who simply happen to live on the other side of a river. The power of the state, when nationalism succeeded in acquiring it, enlarging such power in the process, amplified that essential tension. Whole populations discovered political and emotional investment in their national causes. But outlanders became certainly more alien. The other was confirmed in his otherness. And between nation-states so radically divided as they believed by nature itself, opened gulfs of threatening anarchy. Bridging them was difficult in the best of circumstances, and no hierarchical authority survived to mediate, as the Church had once done. In international affairs, the worst case came to be counted the most reliable. Then industrial technology and applied science enormously amplified the nation-state's power, and when the smoke cleared, the cities of the dead and gradually the nation of the dead revealed themselves to view. Once men lose all grip on reality, observes Barbara Ward, there seems to be no limit to the horrors of hatred and passion and rage they can dredge up from their psychological depths, horrors which normally we use all our social institutions to check. Unleashed nationalism, on the contrary, removes the checks. Which suggests, reverting to Eliot's clue, that no living organic structure could be found sufficiently strong to resist the new death organization because the entire nation was implicated. The death organization was the nation-state itself. It followed that once mechanisms could be devised with which to attack civilian populations would be attacked. The enemy was the enemy nation, which was no more than the corporate body of all the enemy citizens, each of whom, in uniform or not, regardless of age or sex, was individually the enemy. But the nation-state was not the only new political system invented in early modern times. Through the 2 centuries of the nation-state's evolution, the Republic of Science had been evolving in parallel. Founded on openness, international in scope, science survived in the nation-state's midst by limiting its sovereignty to a part of the world which interested the larger system hardly at all, observable natural phenomena. Within that limited compass it proved spectacularly successful, lighting up the darkness, healing the sick, feeding the multitudes. And finally, with the release of nuclear energy, its success brought it into direct confrontation with the political system within which it operated. In 1945, science became the first living organic structure strong enough to challenge the nation-state itself. The conflict between science and the nation-state that has continued and enlarged since 1945 is different from traditional forms of political conflict. Bohr visited the statesmen of his day to explain it, but chose to be diplomatic rather than blunt. He explained that with the coming of nuclear weapons, the world would arrive at an entirely new situation that could not be resolved by war. The situation might be resolved by statesmen sitting down together and negotiating for mutual security. If they did so, the inevitable outcome of such negotiations, given the understandable suspicion on every side, must be an open world. To Winston Churchill, and apparently also to Franklin Roosevelt, Bohr's scenario appeared dangerously naive. In his role as spokesman for the Republic of Science, Bohr certainly carried news of danger, but he was never naive. He was warning the statesmen that science was about to hand them control over a force of nature that would destroy their political system. Considering the slaughter that political system had perpetrated upon the 20th century, he was polite enough not to add the mechanism of its dismantling had turned up none too soon. The bomb that science found hidden in the world and made manifest would destroy the nation-state paradoxically by rendering it defenseless. Against such small and cheap and holocaustal weapons no defense could ever be certain. The thickest shields, from fighter aircraft to Star Wars, could be penetrated merely by multiplying weapons, decoys, and delivery systems. The only security from the bomb would be political, negotiation toward an open world which would increase security by decreasing national sovereignty and damping out the violence that attended it. The consequence of refusing to negotiate would be a temporary monopoly followed by an arms race. That road to nowhere looked so much more familiar than Bohr's open world, which even Oppenheimer sometimes confused with world government, that the nations preferred it and took it. The bomb might be a wall, but until the wall was tested, escalation by escalation, new weapons system by new weapons system, who could prove that clever men, or threatening enemies, might not find a way under its fastness or around? Nuclear weapons might also be enterprise and profit and steady work. They might secure the citadel. They might permit the nation not to send its favored sons to war. More significantly, they would deter major war and freeze into permanence the political status quo. The nation-state could roll on into perpetuity with its sovereignty intact. So it seemed along the way, so it still seems to many. But rather than a guarantor of sovereignty, the arms race has proven a reductio ad absurdum of sovereignty. Though they bristle with holocaustal weapons, the superpowers confront each other today totally vulnerable, totally dependent for their continued survival on mutual and reasonable restraint, their sovereignties so thoroughly compromised that they can exercise their military ambitions only through third-world skirmishes that seldom find conclusive end. The bomb, the final word on the accumulation of power, that matter properly arranged is all power, has saturated national sovereignty and shorted it out. Bohr would surely emphasize that the result of either course, negotiation or arms race, must be the foreclosure of the nation-state. Negotiation to an open world would replace the nation-state with some more tolerant and peaceful and international arrangement that recognized the reality of the bomb. Alternatively, the death machine that we have installed in our midst will destroy the nation-state, ours and our rivals, along with most of the rest of the human world. The weapons with which the superpowers have armed themselves, collectively the equivalent of more than 1 million Hiroshimas, are linked together through their warning systems into a hair-trigger, feedback-looped contrivance, and no human contrivance has ever worked perfectly, nor ever will. Each side is hostage to the other side's errors. The clock ticks. Accidents happen. Nuclear war would abolish the nation-state as certainly as negotiation, but instead of a living open world would replace it with a world of the dead, a world completely closed. Science is sometimes blamed for the nuclear dilemma. Such blame confuses the messenger with the message. Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann did not invent nuclear fission, they discovered it. It was there all along waiting for us, the turn of the screw. If the bomb seems brutal and scientists criminal for assisting at its birth, consider. Would anything less absolute have convinced institutions, capable of perpetrating the First and Second World Wars, of destroying with hardware and callous privation 100 million human beings, to cease and desist? Nor was escalation inevitable. To the contrary, it resulted from a series of deliberate choices the superpowers made in pursuit of national interests. But if the arms race is not a creation of science, however much men trained as scientists and applying the discoveries of science may have helped it along, what constitutes that republic's armament in its continuing conflict with the nation-state? Oddly, from the perspective of previous conflicts, science's highly effective armament is the basic scientific principle of openness. Science fights the exclusivity of the nation-state, an exclusivity that has revealed itself capable of preparing to convert the living world into a dead world of corpses, by sharing its discoveries freely. In Oppenheimer's words, by turning over to mankind at large the greatest possible power to control the world and to deal with it according to its lights and its values. That deep trust in the promise of openness to remake the world must inspire even at the brink of the abyss. Science in conflict with the nation-state demonstrates how an open world could function without chartered violence. The effectiveness of such profound civility is obscured at present because it necessarily operates from within the nation-state itself. turning around and looking back across the half-century since 1945 demonstrates its power. It forced an end to World War, in itself an enormous deliverance. If the arms race now makes that deliverance seem a leap out of the frying pan into the fire, science's response has been to continue to confront the nation-state with the facts and probabilities it discovers in the course of its daily work. Nuclear winter, whatever its level of severity, is one of those probabilities. Damage to the ozone layer is another. The likelihood of widespread epidemics after a nuclear war and of mass starvation because of disruptions in food transport are two more. The nation-states may have understood that nuclear weapons spoil war. The continuing arms race unfortunately demonstrates that they have not yet understood that the nationalist system of exclusion and international confrontation has now become suicidal. Each new contribution to understanding, more knowledge turned over to mankind, must further erode that stubborn and potentially genocidal ignorance. Additional knowledge will certainly continue to emerge. It is not likely to prove massive armaments a blessing. Change is possible. Americans who want the Soviet Union to change first, as Henry Stimson did, should realize that they can only pursue that cause peacefully. The Soviet Union controls a deterrent fully as dangerous as the United States deterrent. And patriots may need reminding that the national security state is not where holy democracy began. The American Revolution foresaw a future much like Bohr's open world, in part because the framers of that revolution and the founders of the Republic of Science drew from a common body of Enlightenment ideas. The national security state that the United States has evolved toward since 1945 is significantly a denial of the American democratic vision, suspicious of diversity, secret, martial, exclusive, monolithic, paranoid. Nationalism conquered both the American thesis and the Russian antithesis of the universalist faith, writes Barbara Ward. The two great federated experiments, based upon a revolutionary concept of the destiny of all mankind, have ended in counterpoint as the two most powerful nation-states in history. But other nations have moderated their belligerence and tempered their ambitions without losing their souls. Sweden was once the scourge of Europe. It gave way. The empty fortress at Kungälv testifies to that. Now it abides honorably and peacefully among the nations. Change is possible because the choice is bare. Change is the only alternative to total death. The conditions have already been established, irrevocably, for the destruction of the human world or its modification into some more collegial commonality. The necessity now is to begin to dismantle the death machine. The energies rich and intelligent peoples have squandered on the elaboration of death need to be turned to the elaboration of life. Bohr's great vision of the complementarity of the bomb can bring hope to the prospect of change. The death machine's suicidal destructiveness is ample reason to work for its dismantling. But although that road is now necessarily longer, the promise still holds, as it has held from the beginning, that negotiating away from chartered violence will be identical to negotiating toward an open world. Democracy has nothing to fear from such a world. Negotiation is in fact already ongoing, partly by necessity, partly by inadvertence. It began when the United States and Great Britain decided to build nuclear weapons secretly and spring them on the world in surprise, thereby precipitating an arms race with the Soviet Union that eventually came to stalemate. It continued when the United States resisted preemptive war in the brief years of its nuclear monopoly, when new delivery systems made defense impossible and thereby further undermined national sovereignty, when nations tolerated overflights and then satellite reconnaissance of their previously sacrosanct territories. It elaborates in custom and tradition every time confrontation leads to prudent stand-down or front-and-back channel resolution. It progresses as commoners in every country slowly come to understand that in a nuclear world their national leaders cannot, no matter how much tribute and control they exact, protect even their citizens' bare lives, the minimum demand the commons have made in exchange for the political authority that is ultimately theirs alone to award. It can be useful to categorize nuclear weapons as a more virulent strain of plague, to consider man-made death as a phenomenon that parallels the older phenomenon of biological death that the people of all the nations, working in peaceful concert, have brought under a measure of control. Eliot draws this comparison productively. Our societies are dedicated to the preservation and care of life. Public death was first recognized as a matter of civilized concern in the 19th century, when some health workers decided that untimely death was a question between men and society, not between men and God. Infant mortality and endemic disease became matters of social responsibility. Since then, and for that reason, millions of lives have been saved. They are not saved by accident or goodwill. Human life is daily deliberately protected from nature by accepted practices of hygiene and medical care, by the control of living conditions and the guidance of human relationships. Mortality statistics are constantly examined to see if the causes of death reveal any areas needing special attention. Because of the success of these practices, the area of public death has, in advanced societies, been taken over by man-made death, once an insignificant or merged part of the spectrum, now almost the whole. When politicians, in tones of grave wonder, characterize our age as one of vast effort in saving human life and enormous vigor in destroying it, they seem to feel they are indicating some mysterious paradox of the human spirit. There is no paradox and no mystery. The difference is that one area of public death has been tackled and secured by the forces of reason, the other has not. The pioneers of public health did not change nature or men, but adjusted the active relationship of men to certain aspects of nature so that the relationship became one of watchful and healthy respect. In doing so, they had to contend with and struggle against the suspicious opposition of those who believed that to interfere with nature was sinful, and even that disease and plague were the result of something sinful in the nature of man himself. The pioneers of public health who proposed to secure the biological death machine for the forces of reason must have felt at the beginning a despair at the magnitude of the task, like the despair many thoughtful citizens today feel at the magnitude of the task of similarly securing the man-made death machine. They persisted and triumphed. Bohr's open world has already been negotiated and installed against a biological death machine. No one any longer considers disease a political issue, and only modern primitives consider it a judgment of God. When the World Health Organization worked through the 1960s and 70s to eradicate smallpox from the earth, a program the Soviet Union initiated, both the Soviet Union and the United States shared the cost of the campaign with the Third World countries involved. The Soviets were not charged with expansionism, nor the Americans with imperialism. World Health Organization health workers of diverse national origin usually found welcome. Once they demonstrated progress and overcame skepticism that containment and then eradication of so pervasive a disease was possible, they won enthusiastic local support. The eradication of smallpox will represent a major milestone in the history of medicine, the director of the campaign, the American physician Donald A. Henderson, wrote in its final phase. It will have demonstrated what can be achieved when governments throughout the world join an international organization in a common purpose. It did. The most devastating and feared natural pestilence in human history is gone, a great victory for mankind. Man-made death is evidently more intractable than biological death. Whether the unarmed republic of science, dedicated to human felicity rather than to the accumulation of power, can force nation-states armed to the teeth to change before they destroy themselves remains to be seen. That no world wars have engulfed us since 1945 is our interim guarantee that the opening up of the world is well begun, though at any time accident or miscalculation could close it forever. That nuclear weapons proliferate and the superpowers exhaust their economies attempting to outmaneuver each other to unattainable dominance demonstrates how irrationally tenacious is our hold on traditional forms of control. In the spring of 1957, former AEC chairman Gordon Dean asked Robert Oppenheimer to comment on Henry Kissinger's forthcoming book, Nuclear Weapons and Foreign Policy. Oppenheimer responded, "Of course Kissinger is right in conceiving the problems of policy planning and strategy in terms of national power, in rough analogy to the national struggles of the 19th century. Yet I have the impression that there are deep things abroad in the world which in time are going to turn the flank of all struggles so conceived. This will not happen today, nor easily as long as Soviet power continues great and unaltered. But nevertheless, I think in time the transnational communities in our culture will begin to play a prominent part in the political structure of the world, and even affect the exercise of power by the states. The preeminent transnational community in our culture is science. With the release of nuclear energy in the first half of the 20th century, that model commonwealth decisively challenged the power of the nation-state. The confrontation is ongoing and inextricably embedded in mortal risk, but it offers at least a distant prospect of felicity. The different country that still opens before us is Bohr's open world. Kansas City, Missouri, 1981 to 1986. This concludes the reading of The Making of the Atomic Bomb by Richard Rhodes. This book was read by Grover Gardner.